Four Spheres of Knowledge Creation. The Causal Principles by René Holmbjerg Bøtker. Chapter 5. Human Apperception. Human beings do not perceive the world as it really is. We experience it through a specific form of perception, an apperception, namely, the human apperception. Human apperception starts where the noumenal world ends. Our understanding of the human apperception is based on the framework which is used to describe the levels of existence. Human apperception starts with the phenomenal world. Although the phenomenal world is our experienced reality, the noumenal world still plays an important part in understanding how knowledge is created. Underlying the phenomenal world of human experience lies the noumenal world. This underlying noumenal world exists as an infinite differentiation of objects, which results in an infinite, undifferentiated noumenal world of indivisible immaterial points. Unlike the noumenal world, the phenomenal world exists as a differentiated finite representation of the undifferentiated infinite noumenal world. It is in this differentiated reality where the human being as an object and its apperception exists. This phenomenal world of human apperception is a complex and finite differentiated analog representation of the infinite, undifferentiated noumenal reality. The phenomenal world is constructed through human apperception, which differentiates the infinite noumenal reality into objects interacting in a spatial and temporal dimension. The human apperception enables the undifferentiated infinite noumenal world to be represented as a finite differentiated reality. This finite differentiated reality exists as a phenomenal representation of objects interacting in space and time. To understand how two objects interact, it is essential that these two interacting objects must be distinguishable from each other. Objects are distinguished through their extension and property. The delineation of an object represents the extension of an object. The definition of an object represents the property of an object. The distinction between objects is apparent from their delineation and definition. Delineation and definition emerge through a process of actualization, whereby objects are differentiated from each other. The actualization process is the process of interaction, where two objects interact through a shared boundary. Through the shared boundary, two objects can interact. Before an object has undergone the actualization process and interacted with another object, the object only exists as a noumenal, undifferentiated immaterial potential object, and not a phenomenal, differentiated material, actualized object. Therefore, interaction between objects is immaterial and never direct. Interaction is an immaterial, indirect exchange of property that takes place in the actualization process as expression and perception. The indirect exchange of property takes place when an object perceives and recognizes the expression of an expressing object. The actualization process is not a spontaneous incident where one object randomly encounters any other object. Any interaction is predicated on the possibility of interaction. For any interaction to take place, a shared boundary needs to be possible. The possibility of a shared boundary to exist is predicated on the ability of an object to perceive the expression of another object. For any actualization process to exist, the circumstances for interaction must be inherently present as property within the objects that engages in the actualization process. The circumstances, which allows interaction, exists noumenally as the pre-established harmony, which allows property to be exchanged through a shared boundary. The infinite noumenal property of an object constitutes the noumenal potential object and the possible representations as an actualized object. Objects exists noumenally as potential objects before the actualization process, and it is through the shared boundaries between potential objects that actualized objects are enabled to exist phenomenally. The actualization process enables the shared boundaries to become apparent and enables objects to be delineated and defined, and thereby present the differences between objects. The differentiation of objects is not only the presence of an object as an entity in the actualization process, but the very emergence of any phenomenal object. The objects interacting in space and time, as human apperception, is the basis of our experience reality, where we, as humans, are both the creators and subjects of the world we live in. Differentiation as delineation. The knowledge that we create is a representation of the human apperception, which consists of objects interacting in space and time. The objects emerge as entities subject to the human apperception through the actualization process. The actualization process takes place when two objects share a boundary. The boundaries that an object shares with another object constitutes the perimeter of an object. This perimeter enables the extension of an object to be delineated. The delineation of an object emerges through the actualization process, where the shared boundary is delineated as a particular finite representation of the potential object. Delineation through a single actualization process thereby represents one possible representation as an actualized object of the infinite possible representations that exists in the potential object. Differentiation as definition. The definition of an object concerns the representation of property through the actualization process, where delineation represents the identification and positioning of an object through its shared boundaries. The definition of an object concerns the immaterial exchange of property as an interaction between two objects. Definitions thereby represents the ability of an object to interact with other objects. As the exchange of property in the actualization process is immaterial, definition is twofold, as it exists both as the expression of property and as perception of property, i.e., definitions can be a representation of how an object can both act and react. It can be a representation of both cause and effect. The expression, which takes place in an actualization process, is a representation of the property of the expressing object. The perception, which takes place in an actualization process, is a representation of the property of the perceiving object. The actualization process is a process of interaction between the two objects. It is the possibility for recognition in the interaction that the actualization process is predicated on. This possibility forms the circumstances through which two objects performs an interaction through expression and perception. In the actualization process, the interaction is predicated on whether the property of the expressing object can be recognized as the property of the perceiving object. Expressions as such are only able to be perceived if a perceiving object can recognize the property of the expressing object in its own property, i.e., cause and effect can only happen if the cause can induce an effect in an object. The interaction is a representation of shared property, which enables an object to be defined through the recognition of property. It is not possible to define an object through property, which is not inherently existing in both interacting objects. Although the property will exist in both objects, the phenomenal representation of this property might not be aligned. The actualization process is a process of interaction, where an object is actualized through an interaction that contains both an expression and a perception. The existence of a phenomenal object is as such always twofold and consists of expressive or perceptive property. The existence of both expressive and perceptive property in the same definition would imply the existence of the same object as two entities in one definition. As such, knowledge cannot contain both expressive and perceptive property as content. The content of knowledge can only be presented either as expressive or perceptive. Expressive content represents the property of the expressing object. Perceptive content represents the property of the perceiving object. It is not possible to talk about cause and effect. It is only possible to talk about cause or effect.